Hi everybody, this is Jackson Michael of The Game Before the Money. This episode is to celebrate Charley Trippi. None other than Jim Thorpe called Charley Trippi probably the greatest football player ever. Fran Tarkenton also said the same thing. Charley was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1968. He passed away on October 19th, 2022. At 100 years old. Charley starred at the University of Georgia in college, was the most valuable player in the Rose Bowl, and was the first overall pick in the 1945 NFL Draft. He also had the option to play for the new All-American Football Conference. He chose to sign with the NFL's Cardinals, which at the time were the Chicago Cardinals. Charley was a very important part of them winning the 1947 NFL championship game and also led them to the 1948 NFL championship game. He was a complete all-around athlete and even played professional baseball. In the National Football League, Charley could basically do it all. He originally was a member of the Cardinals' $1 Million backfield. I got to interview Charley Trippi for the book The Game Before the Money, and got to chat with him a couple of other times. Very thankful to be able to have connected with him. Frequent guest on The Game Before the Money, Upton Bell, met Charley Trippi all the way back in the 1940s, when Charley first walked into Cardinals training camp in 1947. Upton was just a youngster at the time. His father, Bert Bell, was the NFL commissioner, and Upton went to the Cardinals training camp in 1947. He saw Charley Trippi's entire career and even attended the 1947 and 1948 NFL championship games in which Charley played. In the 1947 NFL championship game, Charley ran a punt return back for a touchdown as the Cardinals defeated the Eagles 28-21. Upton joined me in remembering Charley Trippi. Part of the interview aired on the Game Before the Money radio show, which airs nationally each Saturday on the SportsMap Radio Network at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central. It's also available on the SportsMap Radio app. This is my chat with Upton in its entirety as we remember the great Charley Trippi. Met Charley Trippi, you were just saying... 1947. You met him right when he came into training camp for the first time.
Yeah, I was there. The minute he walked on the field, and that magical backfield, Trippi, Angsman, and Harder. The center was Vince Spinonis, and the two really good receivers, borderline Hall of Famers for that time, Billy Dool and Mal Cutner. Quarterback, Paul Chrisman.
What do you remember about Charley Trippi?
There's certain guys that walk on the field and carry themselves in a certain way that right away, it was like, to me, I always thought Charley Trippi was never a rookie. It's like he was very unassuming and really nice. But once they blew the whistle, and remember in those days, you scrimmage all the time, is that basically he glided. Everything he did seemed natural. Catching the football, running with it, making people miss. All those things, and I said, I had seen McAfee, who was the year before, who was terrific on their way to the championship, the Bears at that time. But this guy just kind of stood out, not in a spectacular way where you go, oh my God, did you see that run? He just was so smooth that you felt like every time he got the ball, it was going to be 4, 5, 7 yards, whatever it was, or he could catch it. It's just, I guess, the movie, they talk about the natural. I would say if you talked about football, especially in that era, you would say that Charley Trippi is the natural.
Wow. And then, his rookie year, the 1947, that 1947 NFL championship game, which he scored two. You were there, right?
Yes, and what is interesting about that game is because it was nip and tuck with the Eagles. And the Cardinals, I believe that the Eagles wore cleats on really what was somewhat of a frozen field. And the Cardinals wore sneakers. In some ways, that made a difference because the game really went down to the very end. But Trippi, again, in the championship game, had one of the biggest days of his career, making the big plays when it looked like the Cardinals were going to go down to the Eagles, and of course they finally won. And the following year, the Eagles won. I would say for 2 years, excluding the 1948 championship game, which my father sold to television in a snowstorm, the Cardinals were really kind of the dominant team in football.
You know, that 1947 championship game that you were talking about, you know, Charlie had 2 touchdowns and you know, the most famous one, the punt return for a touchdown. He told me that was the only touchdown that he had ever scored wearing sneakers, like you had brought up the sneakers. So yeah, do you remember that punt return? I think it's the only punt return in a championship game for a touchdown.
It was the only one. As far as I know, it was the only one. And again, you today wouldn't have your most valuable running back. I mean, you never saw Jim Brown, or Steve Van Buren return kickoffs or punts. I mean, they were the bread and butter. They were the great running backs. They didn't do that. And as we know, the 2 most dangerous plays in football are the punt returns and the kickoff returns. Then, not now. Now nobody returns anything. It's kicked in the end zone, that's it. But then you're a player. Remember, there are only 33 players per team. Now we got 200,000 players per team. And so you had to do, including play defense. And you think about that was the return that broke the Eagles' back, really. And it was really amazing. And again, picture doing that, making that run in sneakers. And there is a big difference in playing with cleats on any surface and then playing with sneakers. It's not the same feel. Your cuts, if you make a sharp cut, you could slip and fall. Even though the whole idea was on that type of surface, sneakers were better than cleats. But still, think about that historic return, and he does it on sneakers. But again, everything, if you watch the end of a touchdown run, kickoff return, you name it, or what Charlie did in that game is they score the touchdown, they hand the ball to the official, and they run off like it's just another day's work. I remember from that very first day, I was 10 years old, and I always considered myself like an adult, and you had to kind of be if you were the commissioner's son. And yet the players, that's the other thing. The Bears camp in 46, the Cardinals camp in 47. The way the players treated you, they didn't pat you on the head, hey, little kid, or hey, sonny, whatever else it is. They actually had a conversation with you. How you doing today, Uppy? How's it going, kid? Another person in there while we're talking about Trippi, Marshall Goldberg, who had been moved from offense to defense, was really not only highly intelligent, but really kind of very, very funny, wisecracking. And I always remember going to practice and listening to him. He's so damn funny. And Trippi and all of them would kind of laugh. Think about, too, the quarterback, while we're on this, Michael, the quarterback was Paul Christman, who went on to make a pretty good living working for NBC as their top guy on the AFL, the new league in town. All of those guys, as their career went along, and I know you interviewed Charlie just a while ago, is think about them, think what they were, and think about now what people are. And it is totally not only a different game, but completely different in the people who played it on and off the field. And Trippi is a perfect example. Lived to be 100 years old. I'm sure, because I haven't talked to him in years. You have. I'm telling you, I'll bet he is the same guy today as he was then.
Charley was just a prince of a guy. The chances that I got to chat with him, and just one of the nicest people. You'd never know that he was a tough football player, just being in his presence and getting to chat with him.
That's the way he was the first day I saw him. First day he walked in there, and it's funny. I always watch the way a player walks, even through my scouting years, even through today. How do they walk? They walk with self-assurance. Of course, today everybody's dancing. And the minute I saw him walking in the training camp, and remember in those days too, if you were a big bonus pick, and he was a big name, I mean, from Georgia, All-American, and I believe that before he came in, he was a year in the service.
Yes, he was. Yeah, and he loved to point out that he had played in 5 college all-star games because he had that extra year where he got to play because he had college eligibility. Yeah,
well,
so he did. Yeah, he did serve during his college career, and he came back to finish, even though he was drafted, I believe, in the 1945 draft. He was the first pick overall.
That's correct.
And he waited to come out.
Can you imagine anybody today? And we're not knocking today. Today is totally different. I'm only trying to explain to you, as you do in your broadcasts, that the difference was stark in who those people were. And I always say, going back to our discussion about the Chicago Bears in my first training camp, is the players who came back from the war, whether they served statewide or overseas, they were different. They had seen a lot of things before most young men, today, or even 30, 40 years ago, unless you went to Vietnam. They saw so many things that when they came back, they even at the age of 24, 25, when you think you're still kind of a kid, they were men. They'd seen awful things. They knew awful things. They knew about life and death, all the things. And when they came on the field, it was all business. They kid around a little bit. Guys kid more so today too. That's the one thing I did notice about players. And they would kid, but it was really all business. You wouldn't hear any music. You wouldn't hear any of the things that is part of the natural makeup of the NFL today. What you did is, we're coming out, it's almost like, the platoon sergeant, whether it was George Hallis or whomever it was that was the head coach. It was like, all right, out here, let's get going, that's it. And that's what it was. And in the middle of all of that, I still say, Sid Luckman and Charley Trippi are 2 of the best people I've ever met.
Talking about Charley Trippi, and you mentioned some of his teammates, Paul Christman, Elmer Angsman, they were part of that original $1 million backfield. Yep. I think the 4th might have been Pat Harder, who was later...
Marlon Pat Harder. He was the fullback. Angsman, Trippi and Angsman were the halfbacks. Now we're talking about the technology and the terms of those days. You had a fullback, you had the left halfback, you had the right halfback. And you had Trippi and Angsman, it was the golden backfield. And Pat Harder was the fullback, and Christman was the quarterback. That was a tremendous team. I don't know the Eagles ended up beating them and then going on their run. The Eagles were in it for 3 years, and the Cardinals were in it for 2 years. And I swear that if the Cardinals had won that game that they lost 7-0 in a driving snowstorm, things might have been different. But again, the powers then were the Bears, the Cardinals, the Eagles, and then the Rams. Think about that. And then followed by the Cleveland Browns. You'll never get that today. There are no powers because there are 32 teams.
Yeah, and like you said, the rosters were even smaller.
33 players.
Back then. So you had to be not just the cream of the crop, you had to be the cream of the cream of the crop back in those days and play multiple positions. Like Charley Trippi ended up playing quarterback. He was halfback. I believe he played some defensive back in the NFL.
He did. He did. You had to. Think about even like one of the greatest quarterbacks of his time, Sammy Baugh. He was the best punter in football, and he played defensive back.
And led the NFL in interceptions as a defensive back.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, and people say, well, the game's much bigger, faster, quicker today, I agree with all of that. But you couldn't be just a specialist then. You had to be able to do it all. So think about all the players that would have made it if the rosters were, 45. Today it's 53. Think of all the guys that might have made it, and then think of those people that were part of the start of the AFL that never either got a shot in the NFL or were cut by the NFL. So
a lot of Hall of Famers on that list. Len Dawson is the first that comes to my mind.
All of those players that would have made it could have, and that's why my father was so afraid of the old All-America Conference and wanted to make sure that they brought them in, which he finally effected a merger in 1950. Because I can tell you this, of the games that I was able to see, now it wasn't a lot, but of the games I was able to see, I think I said to my father once, I said, Dad, I think that All-America Conference has better players, has better teams than the NFL. And of course, the Browns, look at that Brown team and went 10 straight years to the championship game. Those Browns teams are among the best I've ever seen, period. Better than the Cardinals, better than the Bears, better than the Eagles. And that's saying a lot.
And what Paul Brown was establishing there, as far as coaching techniques, those are things that kind of set the foundation and are still used today. A lot of the things that Paul Brown used, and Bill Belichick just referred to Paul Brown in an interview this past week. The techniques that Paul Brown used, those are still fundamental coaching techniques that are used today.
They are. Everything from scouting to even the minute, the 40-yard dash was Paul Brown. I remember going to the Brown training camp with my father in 1950, just before they played the Eagles, and said to my father, they're going to kill the Eagles. And my father said to me, Upton, don't say a word about this. And of course, that will kill it right now. But again, everything. That's why I picked in my book Paul Brown as the greatest of all time. And then I had Shula and Belichick tied for second and third. So we'll see. But again, back to your point about Trippi and about that era and about that team. That was a tremendous backfield. It was a tremendous team for 2 years. I thought that they should have been better and come back, but they really didn't. The Eagles took over, and the Eagles then carried it to 50, and then it was the Rams and all the Browns and everything else like that. But Charley Trippi was an unforgettable character because he wasn't a loudmouth. He wasn't somebody that, really pushed his ego on somebody. He just was that satin smooth running back. You get tackled, you get up, go back to the huddle. You figure, wow, like Jim Brown in some ways, he'll never get up because people were shooting for him then. And he just always made the big plays. And I look at him the same way in life. Charley Trippi was class from beginning to end.
Thank you for listening to the Game Before the Money podcast. Don't forget to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. There's a Charley Trippi biography page posted on thegamebeforethemoney.com, and you can also read stories that Charley Trippi shared in the book, The Game Before the Money. Transcriptions of some podcasts are available on thegamebeforethemoney.com. Those transcriptions are powered by our transcription partner, Sonics. SONIX. Visit sonics.ai to learn more.